Pella Neroth-Taylor on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Welcome to the Pella Neroth-Taylor Show. Well, we're going to talk about Ukraine again today. I make no apologies for that. It's a question of an existential question for all of us. Trump famously said he's not worried about global warming, but he's worried about the global warming that results from a nuclear explosion. So with us today, we've got the Gilbert Doctorow. For many of you, he doesn't need an introduction, but I'll give an introduction anyway. He's got a PhD in Russian history from Columbia and speaks fluent Russian. He spent most of his life in corporate Russia with a focus on Russia. He's written 5 books of essays and is well known from various podcasts and YouTube videos. And actually, I'm a regular viewer of his, and so it's a great privilege for me to have him. And he's just published a book of a kind of war diary, which I guess covers his travels to Russia. I think he's got a flat in St. Petersburg. Welcome to the show, Professor Doctorow.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, tell us a little bit about your book, and then we'll spend the first part of the show on that. I'm quite curious because you've got inside experiences, I guess, of actually going to Russia. You speak the language, you watch the media closely. You have a Fingerspitzgefühl, a feeling of what's really going on there, and you see how the country's really doing. You talk to a lot of people there, and then maybe we can focus on some of the other stuff, like the momentous events that are taking place behind the scenes or in front of the scenes. So, what tell us about your book and what it's about?
Well, I say, first of all, what it isn't. This is not a comprehensive history of the war. It is instead a view of how Russia fared during the war, based on my visits there, both before the start of the special military operation and during. This book covers the periods 22-23, when almost all foreign journalists had left Russia. And so my contributions, which you find in this book, to my observations on what was going on in Russia. By that I mean how consumers are doing, what the feeling of prosperity or poverty is, what the chattering classes are saying, and that comes from my following the major talk shows and state newscasts, which are widely watched and talked about in Russia. So these are observations, also books that were published, which are very relevant to our understanding of this war. For example, a book about the 85 days in which the towns of Slavyansk, which is in the center of Donetsk province, which gets a lot of news because it is the front line today. Anyway, this town was the kind of Alamo of the Ukraine in 2014. It was the cradle of what the Russians call the Russian Renaissance or rebirth. And it held out against vastly superior Ukrainian forces. Well, that was written about a very competent book. It received very little attention in the West, and that's the sort of thing that I covered and described in some essays, or I described some documentaries that were produced in Russia relating to the experience of two nations living together for several centuries, that is Russia and Ukraine. These documentaries I found to be highly informative, and they received no coverage in the West. Well, I covered them. So aside from my own personal observations of what I saw in street markets, in supermarkets, in electronic stores, and so forth, what I heard from my taxi drivers, and at least in the period of 22-23, taxi drivers were a very good source of information of what's going on, particularly if you happen to have, as I did once, a retired colonel in the military intelligence driving the car.
Wow.
So this is what you'll find in this book. And it is, I will say one more word, that I view my role here not as an historian in the sense of going through what happened after it happened, but as a chronicler of what's happened around me, and I recorded that. That's why I call these diaries.
I think is an incredibly important perspective, because a lot of people in the alternative media, independent media, call it whatever you like, we're willing to give Russia, the benefit of the doubt simply because our own side lies and propaganda. But you're able to give perhaps you speak Russian and you don't watch Russia with quite the same rose-tinted glasses, and you have a more realistic view. Let's say somebody who's watches the independent shows and believes that the CIA does terrible things and all that. I mean, I'm all on board with that. and read. I mean, there's that fantastic book called Unprovoked. I think Scott Horton is very good on that historical aspect. Reading your book, what perspective coming away from that? What piece of the puzzle would you be able to contribute that they wouldn't get from us Anglophones?
Precisely the Russian perspective. I'm well aware of this Unprovoked. I bought the book. I glanced through it. It is a different approach, of course. It is documentary. It is again history looking backwards. It's compiling relevant documents and after the fact. What you find after the fact is very different from what you find around you in time present. My
Right.
diaries are diaries in the sense that they are time present. They're not
Mm-hmm.
making reference to landmarks, and this gives you advantages and certain disadvantages. The advantage is that you can understand what it's like to live in the period. People living in the period weren't reading history books. They were
Mm,
always guessing what comes next. And part of this
exactly.
was the natural circumstances of what's called the fog of war, where states intentionally conceal what is going on because they don't want to affect their electorate in a way that gets people very riled up, very militant, or very exasperated with the government. They want to keep people calm. So they don't give out the facts. And that's true on both sides, both the
Mm,
Russians and the Ukrainian side. Then you have the distortions that are put in after the fact for political reasons. I think of something very relevant, very recent. We all know that there was a nearly signed peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine that was negotiated in Istanbul in March, the end of March 2022. We learned some details about this when President Putin held it up in front of reporters. There was a thick document. You see, we initialed everything. It was all set to be signed off by the two presidents, himself and Zelensky. And then came Boris Johnson and persuaded Zelensky not to sign it, and it was finished. And we know that close to 1 million people have lost their lives ever since then in the 3 years of war. This is a very nice perspective, but I believe it doesn't reflect the facts. Certainly, it doesn't reflect what you'll find in my book. I took diary notes. I hardly covered in only one diary mention did I speak about the negotiations in Istanbul. At the time, it seemed improbable to succeed, with or
mm,
without Mr. Johnson coming. In fact, his coming
mm,
was hardly known. The
mhm.
point is that after the fact, we can say probably the Russians didn't really want to implement that. And we
Right.
certainly know the Ukrainians didn't because they
Mhm,
staged the massacre in Bucha, which
mhm.
was used to justify breaking off all negotiations. So, could there have been a peace really signed in March, April 2022? It's not clear. And here
Mm.
we have a distortion that's introduced into the current events, what you find in the newspapers today, introduced actually by Mr. Putin, which gives us a false understanding of what the chances were.
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting perspective because you're saying that as somebody who is not, you know, a Ukrainian fanboy, part of the mainstream media and propaganda machine. I mean, you've got a lot of integrity, and you're sort of saying something against the Russians here, saying that they post the event are reconstructing a story that makes them look more peace-minded. But how can you be sure that your contemporaneous perspective, writing diary notes, was more accurate than what was going on behind the scenes? I mean, maybe they were keen on peace. They just didn't tell the talk shows that you were watching or the taxi drivers that you were interviewing.
Of course, nobody can be certain.
Mm,
And it probably will be 50 years from now before you can draw final conclusions. If then, history, by its very nature, is always being rewritten. Not
mm,
necessarily distorted, but the events are viewed from different perspectives because we know where they led. 20 years
mm,
from now, 50 years from now, you know where they led. Today we don't. And so you draw out different elements that took place in time present today, and you give them a different interpretation. As I didn't mean to say that Mr. Putin is distorting things, but he is
mhm,
omitting something very important. There was considerable dissatisfaction within Russian elites over what little they knew about that peace treaty, because it seemed to confer far too many concessions to the Ukrainians. And so I don't think that I know that Russian elites, the people who set the limits on what Mr. Putin can do, because it is a democracy of different from ours, but it is a democracy, and Putin is responsible and answerable to a large swathes of the population, and they were not happy with it. So that is as much as I can say. Was this decisive? Would it have been executed if Boris Johnson had not intervened? Would it have been executed if MI6 did not stage the Bucha massacre to put at the door of the Russians and find an excuse for breaking off negotiations? Who knows? But the question has to be posed. And looking at media discussions today, it isn't being posed.
So I get you. I mean, that's interesting because the Ukrainians rejected even something that the Russian elites thought was too generous to them, which makes me wonder whether anything will be resolved now when Putin is likely to be even harder. I mean, that he might satisfy his public opinion, but he's certainly even less likely to satisfy the Ukrainians. Although, of course, they're losing, they might be more amenable to a deal.
You've identified precisely the reason why I raised this question. It's not an abstract. It's not something picayune, something of minor. No, it's something major in understanding where we are today.
Right.
Can the sides reach an agreement when they're so far apart?
I mean, what do you think the Russians were trying to achieve in 2022? I mean, I was talking to another guest, and I'm wondering whether the West was trying to put it's called a zugzwang in chess. Apparently, you're trying to make your opponent have just bad choices. Whatever he does, it's bad. So if Putin didn't invade, they'd carry on the boiling the frog method of putting more CIA bases into Ukraine. Giving Zelensky his lines about rearming and getting nukes, reinforcing the Black Sea bases, which the British Navy could then get into. And if they get worse and worse for Putin, but if he did invade, they'd hammer Russia with sanctions, and they probably believed that they could destroy the Russian economy that way. So that's a zugzwang, apparently, and Putin could see this, and he acted on that. Would you agree with that?
Let me do a point that I make at the very beginning of my book, and which is worth repeating here. There were many explanations made by the Russians of why they went into the special military operation, and some of them were the ones that you are making now, which are national security issues. Others you haven't mentioned, but were also very prominent, and that was the Russian national defense of Russian national interests, of the speakers of Russian in Ukraine, who had been subjected to oppression, to military strikes on their residences. And I'm speaking now about those provinces in the east of Ukraine who refused to accept the coup d'état of February 2014 and who rebelled. These were then supported largely with verbally, diplomatically, very little militarily by Russia from 2014 on. And to protect them from an ethnic cleansing or genocide, which is one of the reasons why Putin went in February 2022. His intelligence told him that the Ukrainians were ready to pounce. They had concentrated 120,000, 150,000, more than half of their total military. They had concentrated on the border with the rebelling provinces. And they had been armed to the teeth by their Western friends. And so they were supposed by Moscow that there was going to be a genocide. And they moved in on the same principles as the West moved into Libya, of the right to defend or the obligation to defend and protect. So that is a big aside to the special military operation. It is important because that is something that Mr. Putin can address to his public. It speaks to the heart. It is our people, our brothers, our sisters are facing a massacre. They certainly are facing the daily bombardment for the last 8 years from the Kievan forces, and meaning that 14,000 civilians in these rebelling provinces had been killed largely by artillery shells and short-range missiles fired by the Ukrainian government at the rebels, and in their residences, in their playgrounds, in their hospitals. So that message plays to the heartstrings of any people, and the Russian people included. The other side of it, which you were discussing, I think was what really drove this. It was the national security. If the British succeed in establishing naval bases within easy striking range of Sevastopol, where the Russian Navy had its Black Sea headquarters, if long-range missiles, are put in by the Americans and others into Ukraine, then Russia faces a severe security risk. But you can't talk to your people about that. People do not. People anywhere are not moved by these issues of military balance, of raison d'etat, state interests. People do not take that up, send their sons, their fathers, uh, their husbands out to possibly die for these reasons. When you say that it's to preserve the lives of your distant relatives, and of course there are many intermarriages between Russians and Ukrainians, of your distant relatives, your cousins, your father-in-law, and whatever, in these areas of Ukraine, then people are willing to sacrifice their lives for that purpose. So there are several reasons, as I say.
Very good. And you've actually explained it. I mean, I didn't know that the Ukrainians had gathered quite so many. But it's interesting because Zelensky was telling the world media that he wasn't expecting the Russians to attack, even as he must have known it because he was escalating on the border there. Although I did know that the OSCE, the organization that was patrolling the border, had monitoring the border, showed a huge uptick in fire on shellings just before the February invasion, which no one in the West reported. We're just going to go into a break and back after the break.
Get your favorite merchandise from our official The Pulse shop. You'll find exclusive online t-shirts, mugs, hats, hoodies, and more at thepulse.today.
Welcome back to the Pellenier Taylor Show. We've got Gilbert Doctorow with us, who's just written a book of war diaries, which covers him as one of the few sort of geopolitical analysts out there who's actually speaks Russian and has been to Russia and regularly during this special military operation. I think he's got a flat in St. Petersburg, and he wrote a contemporaneous diary, which I think fills in some of the gaps because I've said history, we was looking back, and we kind of, even the best historians create a post hoc reconstruction of events, and yours has got the freshness of being written at the time, and you explained very, very, very clearly what Putin's motivations would have been there. This Bucha massacre, what's been worrying about me, I mean, since that happened, is whether the Brits or someone else will stage another false flag to create something else, right? You know, I mean, that was to create opinion in the West against peace. Would they do something like that again because the stakes are so high? And that might bring us into what Merz is doing, you know, the German chancellor. He's provoking, or, you know, the Russians must be absolutely neuralgic about this. The German chancellor, Lavrov, has been comparing him almost to Hitler, perhaps either knocking down the Kerch Bridge, which has a huge symbolic value, or maybe even striking Moscow, which would force Putin to listen to his public opinion and maybe strike Germany, and then we're into World War III territory. What is Merz trying to do, and what are the Russians doing to combat that?
Well, the Russians have very effective air defense. We have heard in the last week, just before Mr. Trump said that he didn't know what got into Putin, that Putin is absolutely crazy. Before he said that, and the reason he felt justified in saying that, is that all Western media were reporting on the devastating strikes. These are combination strikes of drones and precision missiles, either ground launched or air launched from distances, from significant distances, either from the Black Sea or interior Russia, against major cities, foremost of them Kiev, but also other cities around Ukraine in the last week, or particularly concentrated over last weekend. What our Western media have not reported was what touched that off. Again, throughout the war, it's been the coverage has been like in a kindergarten playground, where the camera shows the fellow who punches the other kid back, but doesn't show how he was punched first. And that's exactly what we have here. The In the lead up to this Russian revenge attacks, and that's what they call them openly, revenge attacks. The Ukrainians had fired more missiles. So it's like something like 2,000, 2,500 missiles were fired, say 50-50, between the Russian occupied eastern provinces of Ukraine and Russian Federation proper. In the latter category, many of them were concentrated on the city of Moscow. The Russians claimed that they knocked down, which means either they shot them down or they used electronic warfare to down them, to disarm the software guiding the drones. These were drones, and but everyone talks about how Ukraine needs missiles in order to do damage to Russia. Well, this is absolutely empty talk. The Ukrainians are doing very well, thank you, with long-range airplane-shaped drones, and they cover more 1,000 kilometers or more. So the idea of striking Moscow or striking industrial or residential cities in the middle of Russia doesn't require a missile. They're doing very well with drones, and drones are actually harder to locate, to identify, and to destroy than missiles are. So, in that sense, the Russians were very, very upset about 2,400 drones swarming, and although they nearly were all downed, that doesn't tell you this whole story. We all know that drone attacks lead to deaths and damage, not from the drone hitting the target, but from the pieces of a destroyed drone coming down to Earth. And so there were deaths among civilians in Russia, even as the Russian military could claim that their air defenses stopped all of the drones. And the response was what I've said. The Russians say that they concentrated their efforts on identifiable military targets, as confirmed by reconnaissance drones. And they've shown on television just what damage they did to this airport, which was used to launch F-16s that themselves launched Storm Shadow missiles against Russia, or against a container ship in the port of Odessa, which had 100 containers of various assemblies for making high-powered drones, as kamikaze drones. This type of site was destroyed, and you've seen pictures of it. And then the Ukrainians are rushing to our press to say that the Russians have struck civilian targets. The numbers speak for themselves. If the Russians indeed launched in 3 days from this last weekend 1,000 or more drones and missiles, the Ukrainians speak of 13 or 30 civilian deaths. What they don't speak about, of course, is military deaths, which were, one can assume, substantial, because among the targets were barracks of mercenaries, French mercenaries, by the way, and of Ukrainian armed forces. But civilian deaths, 30. This is negligible.
It's incredible. I mean, it's the war with the least number of civilian deaths in history, probably, isn't it? And the aim of this, of course, was to break up the peace talks between Russia and the rapprochement between Russia and the United States with the assistance of the Western media, which just reports on what the Russians did, and then allows Merz to say, sort of evoke pictures of terror bombings of World War II somehow, and then maybe get those bone-crunching sanctions and then break off relations between Trump and Putin. Because the media, because Trump seemed quite surprised by what when some reporter pointed out that the Ukrainians had struck first. We've just got time for one last question, although I'd love to continue for longer. But a lot of the independent media are kind of gone sour on Trump. You know, they say they feel he's a traitor and that he's listening to his neocons. But you made an interesting point. You can check out gilbert.doctorow.com for your essays and your transcripts of your interviews. You make the point that he's actually a brave man and he knows what he's doing. He probably knows much more than what people attribute to him. So you said, this is the man who approved closing down USAID, the main instrument for regime change paid for by the CIA. The man who's decapitated the US intelligence agencies, now purging the State Department, who's scaling back the National Security Council from the bloated 200 staff under Biden to a headcount of 60. The man who's doing all this cannot be the buffoon. He is a brave man, knowing what he's doing and probably throwing out a lot of chaff to confuse people and his enemies while being kind of laser focused, playing the buffoon, but actually knows what he's doing. Can you just expand on that for about a minute or two?
Trump talks a lot. Trump talks too much, but his talk is intended to confuse people. He's not confused, I assure you. And I've said the thing about Trump is follow what he does, don't follow what he says. What he says is intended to disarm his opponents, to let them believe that he's a buffoon and that they can influence him and bring him around to their positions. If they believe that, then they don't stick a dagger in his back. And that is what it's all about. But when you look at what he's done, and you just enumerated the things he's done, he didn't even talk about them. They, in fact, are destroying the power base of neocons in the federal government. And people heard about them because Elon Musk is saving money. That was also a cover. There was why exactly is the first place he looked to save money to close down USAID, which was the main instrument for CIA money to stage color revolutions around the world. So trust Trump that he's no fool. He's not a likable personality. I'm not praising him for his egotism and his in-your-face behavior, but he's saving our lives, and he's certainly saving free speech, despite contradictions about free speech over Gaza and so forth. That's all discussable.
Yeah. But I mean, sometimes I disagree with him over Gaza, but I mean, if he stops the war in Ukraine, at least thank him for that. And there's some people in the independent media who so blinded by his apparent kowtowing to Zionism that they can't credit him for Ukraine. Anyway, maybe that's for another time. Or do you want to say a last thing?
Well, it's the last point. It's all politics. His feet are pointing now towards disengagement with Israel, not just with Netanyahu. But the question is, how can he put through his peace plan on Russia and Ukraine, or how can he withdraw the United States from that conflict, as he says he would like to do, without having political capital? You don't do anything without political capital in the federal government. And if he were to do the decent thing, the honest thing, and to denounce what Israel is doing in Gaza for what it is, genocide, he would lose in one day all of his political capital and would be able to do nothing to save you, me, and the rest of the world from a third world war over Ukraine.
Absolutely. I agree with all that. Amen to that. Thank you so much, sir. Incredibly interesting discussion there. Gilbert Doctorow, you can see the name at the bottom. With a .com, you'll find your website, and you Google that or go to Amazon, I guess you can find that, and in many good bookstores. Thank you so much, sir. This is the Pell & Errol Taylor Show, and we'll be back after the break.
For those who crave more than just reading headlines in their social media feeds,
people need to wake up.
Today's news talk, The Pulse.